Since 2008, the government has built fewer than 1,000 new houses for Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory.
This is my daughter's house, Mary. She lives here with extended family group. And 32 people are now living in this one
32
house.
people.
See, the community condemned that house there because the asbestos was all broken.
Yeah.
And it was painted over, it was broken, so it's going to cause health problems in the future.
And so you've had a lot of that pressure, haven't you?
Yes.
Of people having to move from condemned houses into houses like this one. So they've done audits of all of Mutijulu, the whole community. They've found asbestos in 70% of the buildings.
Yeah.
They've identified it like this.
Yes.
And yet they've allowed people to go on living in it.
Yes, because obviously we've got nowhere else to live. We do not. And my main concern, because we've got little kiddies that in this, comes through, is at the moment we're in dire straits. You know, you sleep end to end and end and end, like we done as kids.
There's the bathroom.
Yeah, bathroom and the toilet. With so many people living in here.
You can't renovate an asbestos house. It's got to come down.
So there's 20 people living in a house with one toilet, and every time more people come to stay, the sewer floods. You know, there's raw sewage in the backyard. So you're talking about strongyloides. Sometimes I wonder if I should be testing people for cholera. I'm looking out for it.
Has this house had any money at all from the Housing Authority to renovate it?
We've got not 1 cent to repair our houses. The repairs what we do here, we go to the local rubbish dump and we recycle whatever we can.
Yeah.
That's the way that we have to survive here.
A lot of young children are here too, aren't they?
Well, majority of the household are primary school children.
Primary school children. So that in this kind of overcrowding, that cross-infection that all children are prone to is going to be rampant.
70% hearing impairment amongst the little ones. That's not on.
70%?
This is 70%.
Ear infection.
Yes, yes.
And so they're
Hearing
partly
impairment.
deaf.
They're partly deaf, yes, they are. My daughter here, who owns this house, is deaf. How ironic that my daughter has to put up an asbestos house with 32 people in Australians. This is why we say an abuse of human rights, Australians.
Yeah. There was a report by the Indigenous Doctors Association that mentioned the incidence and degree of malnutrition, starvation.
Oh, absolutely. Malnourished children, people who are overweight, who are still malnourished because they're living basically on flour, and meat, which is subsidised by the council here. Some of the money that comes to the community through the tourism venture is used to subsidise the cost of meat, so people get enough protein. But they don't get enough vitamins because they don't get fruit and vegetables because they're too expensive.
How many people would have to sleep in this bed?
Well, if you can double up the kids, head to foot, head to foot, head to foot, probably about 8 or 9.
8 or 9 kids in one
then
bed.
you've got another mattress with about 3 or 4 who sleep in a single bed.
I mean, you've had report after report by the government saying that the biggest single cause of poverty among Aboriginal people is housing. Following his apology, Kevin Rudd promised, in fact, allotted $700 million to building houses in Indigenous communities. Where is it?
They had 9 brand new vehicles with 11 people in them, 9 vehicles.
These are the housing people. They came and audited the community.
But not once, 7 times, and still the housing condition is still like this. We also have extra people living
outside
here.
So a family be sleeping.
Family be sleeping there.
Well, I feel sometimes like I'm dealing with similar conditions to the English working class in the 1870s, where Or the 1780s, for example, where you had 20 people in a room and an open sewer in the middle of the court, and people dealing with terrible infectious diseases that killed them early, and addictive behaviours from the dispossession that the English working class went through at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
In 2007, Prime Minister John Howard and his Minister Mal Brough declared a state of emergency in the Northern Territory, but they applied it only to black Australians.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Mr Brough and I have called this news conference to announce a number of major measures to deal with what we can only describe as a national emergency in relation to the abuse of children in Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory.
Known as the intervention, its aim, they said, was to save Aboriginal children from pedophiles, but there was a hidden agenda.
It is interventionist. It does push aside the role of the Territory to some degree. I accept that, but what matters more? The constitutional niceties or the care and protection of young children?
The intervention was launched on a very cynical big lie, a vicious one that smeared all Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory, because the Minister for Indigenous Affairs at the time, Mal Brough, said there were pedophile rings in all of these communities that the federal government was going to occupy. An extraordinary sweeping claim. The legislation that delivered the intervention, this federal takeover, doesn't actually mention children, but the propaganda machine from the beginning was relentless.
Everybody in those communities knows who runs the pedophile rings. They know who brings in the petrol. They know who sell the ganja. They need to be taken out of the community and dealt with.
An extraordinary sweeping claim. If we are going to be saving the children, we couldn't have any of the recommendations about talking to the Aboriginal organisations or consulting Aboriginal people or even asking the Aboriginal families, well, what is the status of these children? It was time to send in the troops.
It scared the living daylights out of everybody. It really did. The mothers thought their children was going to be taken away, and they bolted. Everybody left this community.
So the army just rolled in their trucks and pitched their tents in the middle of the community.
Yes, here, right
The Australian Army in an Australian
Yes.
Aboriginal community.
Yes. All these soldiers. We were being attacked.
For the first time in modern Australia, the army was sent into black communities as the spearhead of a government determined to control people's lives and their land. Fear and shock overwhelmed communities. People who refused to hand over the lease of their lands were to be denied basic services like decent housing and sanitation. A government jobs scheme that employed thousands in remote areas was all but eliminated. Benefits and pensions were restricted, and people could only buy essentials with a special basics card. Only black citizens were treated this way. As people's incomes were quarantined, starvation was reported. The government's own review committee found what it called a collective despair among Aboriginal people. The rate of self-harm and attempted suicide quadrupled. Laying the ground for the intervention was a lurid media campaign led by a national TV program called Lateline. Lateline claimed that Aboriginal children were the victims of sex slavery. The program's allegations centred on the community of Mutijulu. A key witness was this man, whose identity was disguised. They called him a former youth worker.
The people who are in control are the drug dealers and the petrol warlords and the pedophiles.
There was no sex slavery, no petrol warlords, no pedophile rings. The anonymous witness was actually a senior government official who had worked in Mutijulu but never lived there. The Late Line program was exposed by investigative journalist Chris Graham, founder of the National Indigenous Times.
In 2006, Late Line began reporting that sexual abuse in Aboriginal communities was rampant and that Aboriginal men were violent and beating and abusing women and children on a scale that can't be believed. And it was that style of extraordinary sensationalist reporting that paved the way for the federal government to introduce policies that, frankly, Australians haven't seen.
I mean, the anonymous youth worker, in fact, was this government official called Gregory Andrews. And he claimed that he'd actually lived there for 7 months.
He hadn't lived there a single night. He'd never stayed overnight in Mutijulu in his life.
I've been told by a number of people of men in the region who go to other communities and get young girls and bring them back to their community and keep them there as sex slaves.
The funniest thing was seeing Greg Andrews, or seeing this man in a hat and a jumper that I knew was his hat and his jumper, and seeing him sitting there talking in this robotic voice about stuff that he'd known about this community or seemingly known about this community. And I'm sitting there watching going, is that Greg? And it was.
And who did you know Greg to be?
So Greg Andrews was my boss in the Office of Indigenous Policy Coordination. He was the Assistant Secretary, the branch manager.
So he was a senior government official?
Yes, yes.
He made all sorts of bizarre claims. He made a claim that he knew of, or he had heard of, children being held in communities against their will and traded amongst communities by Aboriginal men as sex slaves. He claimed that he'd seen women coming to meetings with broken arms and screwdrivers and other implements hanging out of their legs.
Was there any substance at all in any of these claims?
Zero. I mean, none at all.
I asked the man in the hat, Gregory Andrews, for an interview, but he declined. The Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Mal Brough, looking at the evidence, quote unquote, that the program had produced about so-called paedophile rings, said that child abuse was happening in unthinkable numbers. Extraordinary thing to say, wasn't it?
Extraordinary, particularly in the context that he knew the anonymous former youth worker on the ABC program was actually his advisor.
To me, that was indicative of a complete lack of good faith in the production of the program, because if they couldn't get someone more objective than that, it must, to those who were making the program, have made them at least think that there was a possible problem, more than a possible problem, and yet they just went ahead with it.
The Australian Crime Commission, which you set up and gave special powers to, found no evidence. The Northern Territory Police found no evidence. Umpteen reports since then, frankly, have found no evidence.
Well, that
and
is...
I'll reel them off to you if you'd like.
Feel free. Factually incorrect. So what they have